Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
You ever want to call the cops on someone because they're just weird? Well, weird doesn't begin to describe the people and things in these stories. I'm taking a lazy day today, cause, I don't know, I stubbed a toe or something. So enjoy this compilation of scary police stories. They're either from the perspective of police officers or about police officers. If you have a scary work story, be sure to send it to me so I can make it the next piece of hot gossip at the water cooler. Just go to eriecast.com/submit. These are tales from the break room. Warning: the following story contains harsh depictions of violence against pets. Cynthia. From Officer Nobody. I'm a young police officer in a southern city. As a child, it was my dream to become one. I made tinfoil badges and carved sticks to look like pistols. I took reports with crayons and chased imaginary criminals. 20 or so years later, I average 3 hours of sleep and have grueling anxiety attacks. Like my peers, I've seen terrible things. It's what we signed up for, so I don't expect sympathy. In 2018, I responded to a welfare check where I found a 2-week-old decomposed body. The man had hanged himself with copper wire inside a closet. His skin was so rotted that it separated where the wire attached. It was an unwanted but gnarly anatomy lesson. It was mid-June, so the smell was unbearable. But hey, dead bodies were a dime a dozen. In 2019, I helped scrape a woman from the pavement following a crash. Her survived husband watched from a distance. But hey, I dealt with hysterical loved ones weekly. In 2020, I watched a homeless man burn alive inside a shed. He had locked the door from the inside and couldn't find the key. The window was too narrow to climb out of. His space heater had caught fire. But hey, the fire marshal took the report. I don't mean to sound callous or smug. I only want to depict reality. The truth is, as disgusting as those stories are, they are not the reason behind my insomnia. They are not the reason for my anxiety. Frankly, I hardly think about them. My trauma comes from 2021, where I responded to a call that haunts me every second. It was around 3 a.m. I was typing a larceny report in my car while Ozark played in the background. It was the scene where Wendy's lover gets thrown off a building and goes splat in front of Marty. Crazy scene. It was a mid-80s summer night amongst a full moon. By that time, everything was calm. The night shift was short-handed, so my typical beat partner wasn't working. Dispatch requested me for a welfare check. Welfare checks are usually harmless, although it is when you find the most dead bodies. Welfare checks are what they sound like, checking the welfare of a person and ensuring they're okay. The reporting party is usually a family member who couldn't get a hold of the person. I received this information and began driving. I was tasked with checking the welfare of an elderly woman who lived alone on the outskirts of town, barely within city limits. Her granddaughter lived a few states away and hadn't heard from her. She assumed that her grandma accidentally switched her cell phone to silent, as she often did. Dispatch usually sends 2 officers, but every now and again they'll give an officer an option to take the call alone. Because of staffing levels and the nature of the call, I decided to handle it myself. Worst case scenario, Granny bit the dust and I would call a medical examiner to work an unattended death. I drove a good 15 minutes to the residence. Another 100 feet north and it would have been county jurisdiction. Lucky me, right? There were no other houses in the area. It was so quiet that the sound of gravel under my tires was thunderous. Beyond the mailbox was a locked gate and a long dirt driveway. I absolutely did not want to walk that driveway alone in the dark without my patrol car. I grabbed my radio to call for another officer, but changed my mind. I would have looked silly asking for help after committing to doing it solo. Plus, it would have been an even longer drive for them. I decided to man up, jump the gate, and make what turned out to be the worst decision in my life. If it wasn't for the moonlight, it would have been so dark that I couldn't see my feet. I was trained to be tactical with my flashlight, only using it in short bursts. It was a good way to be sneaky. I finally reached the house and stood in front of it. It was an old wooden home with 2 stories. Every window was pitch black, besides one on the second floor, and had a purple curtain with white stripes. I stepped on the unstable wraparound porch and listened carefully. There was nothing but absolute silence. No TV, no creaks, no fans, nothing. Tentatively, I knocked and announced myself. There was no answer and no noise. I knocked even louder and announced again. Still nothing. I stepped off the porch to reevaluate the situation. Once far enough, I looked up to the second story. The light was off. Typically, something like that wouldn't creep me out, but the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. Since the light was off, I couldn't see whether someone was looking back at me. I had a terrifying feeling that they were. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in through the window. No one was standing there, but the curtain had moved and was still swaying. I went back to the door and knocked even louder, telling her who I was and why I was there. "Cynthia, it's Officer Blank with the Blank Police Department. I'm just checking your welfare." I stood there for several minutes in eerie silence. I was ready to hightail it back to the road, but figured I'd wait another minute. I had done my job for the most part. I was there to make sure she wasn't dead. If she wanted to ignore me, fine. I was creeped out, and without a partner, I wasn't going to press the issue. For some reason, before walking away, I decided to try the doorknob. This isn't usual practice, since it could be deemed a violation of the Fourth Amendment. I couldn't enter the home without a warrant, exigent circumstances, or permission. To my surprise and regret, the door opened. Apparently, the heavy wooden door needed its hinges tightened, because it slowly opened all the way until it knocked against the wall. I shined my light inside. It was definitely an old woman's residence. Everything was lavender and tidy. There were creepy portraits of hairless cats on the walls. There were also statues of them. I reached my hand inside to flick on the light, but it didn't activate. At first, I thought the house had no power. There were no sounds of electricity at all, and it was hotter than a sauna with no airflow. Then I remembered the light upstairs. The whole situation was odd and unsettling. I decided to dial my supervisor to get his opinion. I was hoping he would tell me to leave, call the reporting person, and explain what I observed. Before I was able to dial, I heard a sound which haunts me every night. A chilling noise that will die with me. You won't believe me, and I don't blame you. It was the sound of intense laughter. Not a giggle, but delirious, gut-busting laughter from what sounded like an old lady. I never drew my Glock faster than I did right then. "Hello? Who's in there?" Before I could finish the sentence, it stopped. I'm not too embarrassed to admit that I turned around and bolted for my car, gun in hand. Just as I left the porch, I was stopped in my tracks. Another equally loud and terrifying noise echoed from the house. This time, it was a scream of someone clearly in distress. It sounded like the same voice, but I wasn't sure. Dang it, I thought to myself. Exigent circumstances. I radioed dispatch and told them what I heard. I advised them that I would be clearing the house. Another officer started en route, but I couldn't wait. I wanted to, but there was no way I could explain waiting 15 to 20 minutes to enter the house of an elderly woman in danger. I entered the hot living room and cleared the immediate area. I knew at least one person was upstairs. The narrow staircase led to a pitch-black second floor. Before going up, I announced myself again, and again, to no avail. I began walking up the staircase as calmly as I could. I remember imagining a scenario where I'm clearing the bedrooms and Cynthia pops out of a dark corner. I'd have to explain to the reporting person why I shot her grandma in the face. When upstairs, I checked 2 rooms that were completely empty. No furniture or anything. I then realized that the last bedroom was the same one that had the light. I announced myself and prayed for a response. I didn't get one, so I grabbed the doorknob and twisted. I swung it open and was immediately met with a nauseating odor. It was the worst I'd ever experienced, almost knocking me down. I illuminated the room with my light. In every corner, on every wall, were dead-skinned cats pinned to wooden crosses. Some were rotten, some were fresh. There was dried blood literally everywhere. Fur and detached claws covered the floor. I dry-heaved as I cleared the closet. It was empty. I stumbled my way back downstairs where I vomited on the front porch. I ran to the road to wait for my partner. Once he arrived, we called for even more people and my supervisor. We cleared the house again with no signs of Cynthia. Fast forward to the next evening. The reporting person flew in with other family members. They searched the 10 or so acres and found an old abandoned car in the brush. They found her grandma there, leaned back in the passenger seat, deceased for what appeared to be several days. Neither detectives nor the medical examiner would determine the cause of death. Detectives interviewed another family member who said Cynthia had severe schizophrenia and dementia. Inside her home in a kitchen drawer, detectives discovered pages and pages of Hebrew writings. The writings translated to devoted allegiances to the devil Tarot, a devil god that many Satanists worship. Her writings claimed that Tarot asked her to sacrifice her beloved cats. Some believe that I heard Cynthia's laughter and scream and that the upstairs light was on. Some don't. Trust me, sometimes I question it myself. For some reason, my body camera never downloaded to the system. It's like the footage never existed, even though I know it was on. No other calls from that night downloaded either. It even baffled my department. I have constant nightmares about Cynthia. In them, she's laughing with the same terrifying laugh. She has unusually long fingers and nails that almost scrape the ground when she walks. I never move fast enough to get away from her. I reach for my gun, but it's never there. She always gets me, and then I wake up. I don't know why I'm still a cop. Maybe it's all I know how to do. I only have 12 more years and many, many more therapy sessions before I can retire. I wasn't a supernatural believer before my experience, but I am now. To those aspiring to be police officers, heed my advice. Be a firefighter instead. New Hire Nightmare from Parkler. Back in 2015, I was working in food service, specifically as a supervisor for a coffee shop. Pretty soon into my actual training, the manager at the time decided she was going to leave and open up her own coffee shop. She hired maybe 3 to 4 people before leaving so that we wouldn't, in her words, be short-staffed. While doing this, she was not as careful as she was before about who she was hiring, which brings me to my work nightmare. Tony will be his name in the story. Tony seemed nice at first. He was probably in his early 20s, average height and thin build. I was a short 23-year-old who was living as a stealth male, as I was transitioning from female to male. At this point, I have almost all of my surgeries and have been on hormones for 3 years, so there was truly no questioning. People didn't know unless they were told. My coworkers were all well aware, because they had been there for most of my surgeries. Tony was not very good at his job. He was struggling to pick it up and was stressing everybody out. I always tried to be nice to him though, because I know how hard learning all that could be, and that's just my general personality. One night while I was sitting at the bar with my dad and my best friend, enjoying a drink before a lacrosse game, I got a Facebook message request. I skimmed through the profile of someone named Riley for a minute and then opened the message. It seemed normal. It consisted of a standard greeting, a simple "Hi, how are you?" And then it turned very dark very quickly when I asked who they were. It was obvious it was a fake account. so I didn't expect anything other than to be trolled. That was until they said that they knew who I was and where I worked, which wasn't out of the ordinary. A lot of our regulars were super friendly with me, so much so that they would often give me gifts before my surgeries. But this certainly was not irregular. As I opened up the new message after hearing the familiar ding and feeling the phone vibrate, I was horrified. It was a slew of messages threatening to throw hot coffee on my face, beat me up at work, and many more things. The messages taunted me, saying I couldn't prepare for it because I had no idea who they were, so I wouldn't know who to look out for. Now, I know that doesn't sound too scary, but let me set the scene. I worked at a kiosk in the mall. Everything around me was open, as well as the back of the kiosk being wide open to a seating area for us, as well as a staircase leading to and from upstairs. There was very little protection. When the mall and police came together and did drills for active shooters, we would have to go hide in other stores or hope we could make it to the back room, which was down a dark, barely lit old hallway that was not as populated as you would think. A few days passed from getting the first message request, and I'm still getting these messages, but I'm not answering as much, if at all, sometimes. I was hoping that if they didn't get the responses they wanted, they would just leave me alone. But then they said something one day. It was something that keyed me in on the fact that this was Tony. Tony made a comment about how I was not a real man, and that while I was going down the hall to the back room at night, they were going to teach me a lesson. And he threatened me with sexual assault, stating that no one could help me. I was horrified. At this point, most of my coworkers knew a little bit about what was going on, enough that they were all worried and protective over me, which made the kiosk tense, especially since everyone agreed it was probably Tony. Our manager refused to listen to us, but said he would put us on separate shifts. My brother even went and bought me a keychain with mace on it, which you have to travel outside of where we live to a state 3 hours over to purchase. I added that to my keys for work, and my ex-boyfriend at the time made sure that I had a small wooden baseball bat in my car at all times. Whenever I would go on break, whether Tony was working or not, especially when he wasn't, all my coworkers would keep an eye out on the open spots of the kiosk to make sure everything was okay. I remember vividly one time, one of the shyest coworkers peered over the kiosk and could not see where I was sitting, and quickly ran out panicking. Those messages kept coming with threats, and eventually we hit a breaking point. One day we were slammed with customers, and Tony was working. Most of the customers were being polite about the wait, and with Tony not being too good at his job yet. I tossed him on the register. We had 2 of them, so he wasn't working alone. I was supporting the staff by filling the ice bins, getting them things they were low and out of, when suddenly a coworker walked up. They were pale and looked flustered. I was told a customer wanted to speak to the person in charge, so I stepped outside the kiosk, taking off my apron and approaching the woman away from everyone. The woman told me that she didn't want to get anyone in trouble, and by that sentence alone I knew it would be bad, but I could have never imagined what she would tell me next. She proceeded to explain that not only was Tony rude when she told him he gave her the wrong food item and complained her drink order was too crazy, it was only a hot latte with 2 Splendas, but then told her it was her fault because she sounded like, quote-unquote, she had a man's groin in her mouth. At this point, the poor lady was holding back tears. She told me she was already self-conscious about her voice, as she had beat cancer and was left with her voice changed forever. I wish I could have seen my face because I was mortified. I quickly began apologizing, asking her to wait around a moment while I called our manager and HR. I asked a coworker to run the floor for a moment and told Tony to go do some back-of-house work, like cleaning the milk fridge. Once Tony walked away, I filled 4 recovery cards and refunded the woman's order while calling the manager. The customer left, telling me I didn't have to do all of that, but that I made the situation right just by being kind. A day passed, and Tony was given a final warning. I dreaded having to work with him, but I knew during launch week I had no choice. One night, after a few really disgusting messages from Riley, I deliberately said something that I figured would make Tony finally admit it was him. And sure enough it did, but not how I was planning. I came in for my shift the next day. the manager asked to have a meeting with me. I walked into the back room with another supervisor who was also asked to be there. And who else was there? Tony. Turns out Tony claimed that I was saying racist things to him, and without me having proof, I was given a warning. That's when Tony turned around and specifically mentioned how over Facebook I called him a sexual predator, which I'd only said to this Riley. I looked at Tony and I yelled, "I knew it was you!" He tried to turn it around and said that it was his friends. That was the icing on the cake. My manager finally had something to prove that he was the one messaging me. He was fired that day on the spot. Work felt a lot less stressful, but we were all still pretty worried because now he was angry at me. My manager reached out to the mall security, and that's when we found out the most amusing news. Something the original manager should have found out earlier when she hired Tony. Tony was banned from the mall a year prior. He wasn't even supposed to be in the mall. After a bit of time passed and he was no longer able to come to the mall, I began to enjoy my work again. So, Tony, let's never meet again.
My most horrifying experience as a cop. An account shared with us by Mythology Loves Horror. I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, acing my exams and tests. It wasn't long before I had a job offer after my official graduation. Despite the job being across the country, I eagerly took a flight and flew over, wanting to be seen as dependable and excited. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or angry bull moose don't kill you, then there's still plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainer at the state police barracks in Newport, I thought it'd be all pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup, but I was wrong. I originally came from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough woman, but I know now that I'm woefully unequipped to handle everything out there. I don't think anyone's equipped to handle a situation like this one. The call that started this experience should have been a standard domestic abuse case, but it turned into something else. In the 3.5 years that I've been there, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished by fallen trees, cars that had been totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought all that was bad enough, but I was not prepared to find myself in a situation that I could not logic my way out of. I didn't have any paperwork left to do that Saturday, and because I'm trained in the field, I asked my friend Officer T if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse call that had just come in. His partner had already gone home for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out to the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement. I hadn't gone out in the field in a few months, and I'd been itching for some action now, especially since my most recent class had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining them into my mind. We were to speak with a Mr. B who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I drove for about 15 minutes, and eventually we found ourselves on one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was nearly up to our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. We cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch black out. It was a concerned neighbor who had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the houses. We'd been under the impression that the fighting had been occurring inside her neighbor's house, but apparently that was not the case. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard screams. They were very hard to describe. They sounded like a strangely pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted for about 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was saying actual words. It was more a cry of sheer terror, stuck on an infinite loop. My adrenaline was pumping so hard that I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. Protocol dictates that we could go next door and question the suspect, but under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize their safety over standard inquiries. This being the case, we sprinted from the porch, making our way as quickly and carefully as we could towards that awkward sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams. Each of them getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved, and as we made our way deeper into the woods, we quietly discussed whether or not we thought it was an animal or a person. The screams of a mountain lion can sound just like those of a distressed woman, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally beginning to approach the creek bed, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We had begun calling out for someone to come forward if they were there, or to help lead us to whoever was hurt, but there was no other sounds. I had been checking for footprints, but there were only ours and deer tracks. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage, but even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area and hadn't seen any signs of a blood trail or struggle. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car when the air around us erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomenon that I was, and then we heard an exact copy of that scream from when we were on the porch. It came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate. And then there was a chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear his footsteps crunching for a long time, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split moment, I thought that I saw his eyes shine bright yellow in the beam from my flashlight. I dismissed that thought, knowing that the glint of snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him that we needed to get out of here. He looked almost angry for a moment, then he crossed the clearing to me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he had been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right. I nearly screamed out loud. That was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arm and all but dragged him back through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his bicep so that he wouldn't stumble again. I was 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get us through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we got halfway back to the house, the scream came again, this time sounding like it was right next to me. In a panic, I frantically shone my flashlight around in every direction to find it, to find what we were being pursued by. But there was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was not even a glint of animal eyes, no rustling of bushes, no sounds of footfalls, just tense silence after that scream. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air. But I swear, I heard it calling my name. By then, I was too horrified to go back out there. I tried my best to keep my wits about me, enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. But she never did call again, and the officer who did a follow-up the next day did not report anything unusual. That night, I got Officer T and I out of there as fast as the cruiser would go, and I don't regret that choice. I still have no idea what was in those woods, but as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animal makes that kind of wail. Whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, telling me that I should be glad I got out of there alive. He says that the danger that night was closer than I knew. I think only he knows how close of a call it was.
Dirty Laundry from Jordan V. I've put up with so many different things throughout the jobs I've worked in my life. From back-breaking janitor cleaning up massive shows at a stadium to losing a tooth on my last day working at Pizza Hut. This experience, however, is about an Uber drive. During that period of time, due to COVID, living in Wichita, Kansas was interesting to say the least. We're technically the biggest city in Kansas, since most of the Kansas City is in Missouri. That being said, we're still not that big. The population isn't packed in super close together. Things did shut down for a few months, as well as having a lot of people wear masks over their faces. Both Uber and Lyft drivers decided to temporarily quit as well. That being said, I had a plethora of people still needing rides. Being one of the few drivers around, people have been more than grateful for my service. Because of all the generosity, I did put my guard down a little. Cue the day in question. It was the first time since the pandemic began that I had to wait a while to get a ride request for an Uber ride. Bans had been lifted here in the last few weeks. Things seemed to be going mostly back to normal. I was driving around for almost an hour until I finally got a ride request. Feeling a bit relieved, I began to head out to a not-so-glamorous motel on the side of the highway. I pulled up to a woman waving me down. She had a pit bull running around her with no collar, no leash. The dog looked friendly, and I generally love dogs. That being said, I've also seen what a dog can do if they get violent, despite what type of breed. On top of that, the woman had a bunch of luggage. Except this wasn't luggage in suitcases. This looked more like someone packed in everything they owned. Clothes, accessories spilling out of laundry baskets and trash bags. Feeling nervous about this, I rolled down the window and I saw her walk up. Following behind her, almost out of nowhere, popped up another woman with a small chihuahua running around, along with some guys that clearly looked like they lived something of a gangster lifestyle. I think I counted 4 guys in total, some without shirts, some had gang tattoos showing. One even had a gang symbol on his face. I know the signs of regular tattoos and the one showing gang initiation. In a quick panic, I tell the woman I can only take 3 passengers. That's actually true, since most drivers in Uber are being asked to keep the front seat open due to COVID restrictions. The woman looks at me and says that only her, the other woman, and the small dog will be riding. I still needed to open up the back of my RAV4 that I drive so she could load her stuff up. Reluctantly, I agree. I get out and open the back. I kept my eyes peeled though, because everyone's body language was that of nervousness. They seemed in a hurry about something. The woman loading up her clothes seemed to be in her 20s. As she loaded up, more guys showed up with yet another woman. I heard a conversation going on, but I couldn't make out many words, as it was more of a shouting match with one of the guys, as well as the new people who showed up. 2 guys walked past me, as if I was part of some problem that the main woman had caused. It was around that time that her other friend asked if she could smoke in the car. She was pale, skinny, and I guess around her late teens or early 20s. I told her no, while more loud, confusing shouting was heard. By then, the lady was ready to go, basically telling one of her guy friends to put the rest of her junk in his car, as mine was already full. She even told him to take the dog with him as well. Honestly, I felt a bit relieved at that, because I didn't want that huge dog wandering and moving around in the car while I drove. As I got back into my ride, I noticed the guy she told to get the rest and her dog just up and disappeared. By now, both women wanted to leave right as quickly as possible. They were in a hurry before, sure, but now it seemed much more urgent. Not to mention, it was then I noticed that no one else was in the parking lot. With as many people running around, to just leaving so quickly and quietly put me more in an alert state. Just as I pull the car into reverse, I hear, "Hey, hold on, the other dog is still out." One of the women quickly gets out and puts the dog in one of the motel rooms. A few minutes later, we're finally ready to go. But I noticed her guy friend hasn't touched any of her stuff, still leaving it in the parking lot out in the open. I start the ride, asking if they're going to another motel down the highway, which would have been about a 5-minute drive. They said yeah, and we pulled out on the side of the highway. I'm not even driving 20 seconds when I hear, "Hey, can you go faster? There's people following us. They want to hurt us." I looked in the mirror. Sure enough, there did seem to be a Jeep following us. I don't know if the girls are telling the truth, or if they're just possibly paranoid, but I purposely make it seem as if I'm going to pull onto the highway, just to pull back into the lane I was in last second. My heart drops when I see the Jeep try to follow me off the highway, only to yank back onto the lane we were once in. This confirmed I was in fact being followed. Now I was looking at my Uber GPS, the road, and my rearview mirror, thinking, what do I do? The ladies in the back were panicking. I knew another off-ramp was coming up, where I could either go onto the main road, onto the highway, or down to the airport. I didn't want people to get hurt in case we ended up in a high-speed chase, especially since it was still rush hour traffic. I then remembered there's always a cop on duty by the one terminal of the airport. It was then I headed down south to the airport terminal, which was luckily about a mile away. Luck was on my side, as there were only a couple of cars in the double-lane street that led to the airport. I then gunned the car to 60 miles per hour, but the Jeep surpassed that and was soon on the other lane next to me. I saw a woman then in the passenger seat, yelling at me, pointing at me. I could only just get a glimpse of the man in the driver's seat, and I couldn't tell if they had people in the back or not. The frantic woman shouting at me made it clear they didn't care that I was an Uber driver doing my job. I sped up some more, getting ahead of them as we made it to the terminal. No other cars were around at the time, thankfully, since airport business has been slow since the outbreak. The only other vehicle around was, of course, the police truck that I was looking for. I quickly pulled up beside it, bolting out of my car as I see the Jeep right next to me. I didn't dare look at that Jeep. I was afraid they would get out and that maybe they'd have a gun, or they were just going to ram right into me. I only had to rush a few yards to the truck in front of me until the people in the Jeep realized there was a cop around, at which point I hoped they wouldn't take any chances and would drive away. And that's exactly what happened. This again was rather lucky. As I looked inside the truck, I noticed the officers were not even there. Being an Uber driver, I knew that the officers were usually there, as all sorts of chaos can happen when people drop off and pick up at the terminal. Relieved that the Jeep drove off, I turned around to hear a voice. A man with a small dog on a leash yelled at me, asking if I had a lighter. I have no idea what that man was doing out here, but honestly, I didn't care. I had so much on my mind, I just ignored him and headed back to my car as he followed. He yelled the question again, and I blurted back, saying, "Look, I don't have any money or a lighter. I'm just an Uber driver doing my job." He yelled BS and some other profanities, but I really didn't care. I just thought, freaking really? Do I have to deal with this too? I got in my car and drove away. I didn't even get a second to relax. I kept thinking the Jeep might be parked somewhere, waiting for us, probably at the main exit that leads back to the highway. However, I'm very familiar with the airport. I knew of some back roads to take that could easily get me to my destination, where the ladies wanted to be dropped off. It was still risky, but I didn't have time to search the area, and knowing calling 911 would just stall things even longer when I'm just so close to this ride being done with. I take the chance, and I use the back roads. Within 4 minutes, I find myself at the motel. It's here that I realized my other mistake. The lady still had a whole bunch of stuff to unload, and that motel is also on the side of the road, by the highway. And if the Jeep happened to come down this way, they would see my car. While I wanted to just dump the lady's pile of personal junk on the driveway, I knew I really shouldn't do that. The two of them go and get a room. About 5 minutes later, they come back, grabbing all their things, and I do admit I helped. All this time, I'm just slightly worried the Jeep will find us. Eventually, I'm able to leave and even have another ride request. So I take off, and I find out that one of my doors doesn't shut right. I dreaded pulling over, thinking getting this door shut is what is going to get me caught. I should have just left and dealt with it later. I quickly get out and slam all the doors shut, not knowing which one is the culprit. Yet it seems that I was safe as I make my way on to the next trip. I had a couple of rides that took me throughout the east side of Wichita, all the while making sure that Jeep wasn't there. After a while, knowing I was safe, I called it quits for the day. As I said earlier, I put up with so many crazy and dangerous things in the past, but having crazy people trying to chase you down, not even knowing why, not knowing what they're capable of, still racked my nerves. The worst part is, I only made $6 and some change for the ride. This episode is brought to you by Drakenblood. EerieCast has completed its first horror novel, a dark fantasy adventure called Drakenblood. The ebook is now up for pre-order on Amazon, and here's the killer synopsis. Drakenblood, the blood of ancient dragons, is bestowed as a gift upon royalty, granting them superhuman aspects to make them more perfect rulers. But when strange crimson rains begin to fall, those who partook in Drakenblood burst into powerful inhuman monsters, and those who touch the blood rain become lesser beasts themselves. Years after the collapse of the kingdom, Ulrin Emberland, prince to the malformed king, seeks to slay his now monstrous father and reclaim his kingdom, or die trying. Discover bloody fantasy and gothic terror in Drakenblood, the Malformed King. The ebook, paperback, and hardcover will release on October 6, 2023. Pre-orders for the ebook are available now. Go to EerieCast.com and click Shop, or go to Amazon and search for Drakenblood. Blood is spelled with a U. If you're a member of EerieCast Plus, you can read the ebook right now as part of your membership. Just log in and check my newest post for download links. An audiobook will release on October 6 as well, narrated by Nature's Temper, but it will be exclusive to EerieCast Plus members at EerieCast.com/plus. Now, back to the show. The crime scene that made me quit the police force. From Byron Siren. I guess you could say I'm haunted by the past. Sounds cliche, right? But when you've seen what I've seen, it tends to stick with you. Our town was a quiet place, barely a blip on the map. Everyone knew everyone, and the most trouble we'd ever seen was the odd case of public drunkenness or a petty theft. That all changed one night in our southern Texas town. I was new to the force back then, still wet behind the ears, they'd say. My radio squawked into life in the middle of the night one night, disturbing the usual static. Dispatch was on the line. The woman's voice was shaky. "Reports of screams coming from the Pearsons' ranch house on the outskirts." Quick note, the names in this story have been changed for the sake of anonymity. My gut twisted. The Pearsons were a good family. I answered dispatch. "Byron here. Who was the caller on that?" Dispatch soon replied. "The caller wished to remain anonymous." "All right, on my way." To be honest, unease festered inside me at that moment. After about 25 to 30 minutes, I pulled up to the Pearson ranch. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Not the comforting quiet like before, but an oppressive one. No insects chirping, not even wind rustling through the trees, just dead silence. The house was pitch black, save for one flickering porch light. Its feeble glow threw monstrous shadows across the yard. I shivered despite the summer heat. A chill of dread ran down my spine. I got out and approached the house, my flashlight in hand. The moment I opened that door, the smell hit me like a punch in the gut. Metallic, rotten. I swallowed down the bile rising in my throat. The house was even more silent somehow, quiet as a grave. Each creak of the floorboards under my weight sounded like a gunshot. The faint light from the flashlight danced over splashes of red on the floor and walls. I'd seen enough horror films to know what it was, but nothing prepares you for the real thing. Navigating the house was like wading through molasses. Each step took me deeper into the horror, and with it, the evidence of a struggle was clear as day. Furniture knocked over, frames shattered, a streak of that dreadful red across the wallpaper. The silence was replaced by the thump of my heart in my ears and the ragged sound of my breathing. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, every groan of the aged timber echoing my growing terror. It was the living room where I found them. The family of four I'd known for years, the Pearsons, now unrecognizable. They'd been skinned alive. Their vacant eyes stared into nothingness, faces twisted in a haunted way, screams frozen in time. I stood rooted to the spot, my mind rejecting the scene before me, but the raw, bloodied bodies didn't lie. Racing out of that hellish place, I doubled over in the bushes, vomiting until my stomach clenched in painful spasms. I'd seen bodies before, car crashes, heart attacks, even someone who had taken their own life once. But nothing could have prepared me for that grotesque spectacle inside. It was like the most nightmarish painting come to life. I'd stumbled right into the heart of darkness, the ugly, horrible side of humanity. The cool night air did little to soothe me. I could still smell the metallic tang of blood, the putrid scent of decay lingering in my nostrils. I gasped, sucking in lungfuls of air, trying to purge the image seared into my mind. It was then I noticed a symbol scratched into the wooden door frame, a mark I'd seen before in confidential files down at the station, one of the Mexican cartel's calling card. Gritting my teeth, I pulled out my radio. Dispatch answered on the first ring. I relayed the scene to her, my voice a tight, clipped monotone. I heard her sharp intake of breath as I mentioned the cartel's mark. The line went silent for a moment before she promised to send backup. Then all was quiet again. I paced the yard, hands shaking, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I waited for backup. All the while, my mind played a twisted game on me, forcing the looping images of the carnage inside into my head. I kept coming back to that mark. The cartel had reached our quiet town, leaving their bloody message on a family's doorstep. My skin crawled at the thought. I prayed this wasn't the start of a war that our small town force was ill-equipped to handle. And right then, all I could do was wait. trapped in a horror I couldn't escape. Those long minutes waiting for backup felt like hours. Alone in the dark, my thoughts turned over the gruesome scene I'd witnessed. The image of the family, brutally disfigured, was etched into my mind. The peace of my small town felt like a distant memory, tainted by the violent presence of the cartel. The quiet streets and friendly faces were marred by a bloody, unseen horror. Then it hit me. A realization which sent a fresh wave of cold dread washing over me. The screams. The initial report that led me here. They weren't from the Pearsons. The Pearsons' ranch was too far removed from the other residents for anyone to hear, much too far from the road for passersby to hear it. But someone had. Someone who was close enough. My heart pounded in my chest. The dispatcher's words echoed in my mind. The caller wished to remain anonymous. The dread coiled around my gut, pushing me back to my cruiser. Safety was just across the yard. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself to move. I reached for the handle when I saw it. Bloody handprints smeared across my cruiser's windows. The sight nearly took my breath away. They had been watching me. I retired from the force not long after that. The weight of that night was too much to bear. Now, years later, I'm just an old man haunted by memories. I've told this story before, at bars, at gatherings, even around campfires. Each retelling is like peeling a scab off an old wound. It hurts, but maybe that's my penance. The bloody handprints never left me, a cruel memento from the darkest moment of my life. I'll always wonder about the person who called in that night. Did they know what they were leading me into? Were they the one who left those bloody handprints on my cruiser? Were they the one watching? I suppose I'll never know. The memory of that night is like a shadow, always there, lurking at the edges of my mind. It's my own personal horror story, a chilling tale that still sends shivers down my spine, reminding me of a peace forever shattered, and how close I came to being skinned alive myself. The Horror at the Library. From Mivonkik. As a college student, I really enjoyed reading books. I read a lot of stuff, related to and not related to my studies. Most of my friends call me a bookworm. I would even spend most of my free time in the library. If you found me there, I'd either be studying or just reading. During my summer break from college, I was looking for a summer job. I wanted to save up some money and buy my own car, so I could take my friends and I on small road trips. There weren't a lot of job offers in my town. It's a pretty small town. The best thing I could find was a job as a garbage man, which didn't really sound appealing to me. I almost gave up. But then, one day, when I was bringing some books back into my local library, I saw a sign saying students wanted for a summer job. For me, it was a dream come true. Immediately after I returned my books, I applied for the job without hesitation. A few days after I applied, I was invited back for a quick chat. I met with an elderly lady named Natasha, whom I knew pretty well, as she lends me books constantly. She told me the job was pretty easy, but the only downside was I would need to work night shifts. You see, the library was open until midnight, and I would be in charge of checking out books, shelving returned ones, and keeping the place tidy and quiet. Honestly, I didn't mind working during the night, because I didn't have anything better to do after 7 p.m. So naturally, I was thrilled when I got the job, even though it meant working night shifts. As I said earlier, the library was open until midnight, so I would come in around 4 p.m. and start my job. Most of my colleagues would go home by then, and I would be alone with Natasha. She would usually leave around 8 p.m., which meant I would be working alone for 4 hours, which wasn't as bad as it sounded. On my first day, She showed me where she kept the keys for the main doors, how to scan books that are being taken or returned, and she gave me a lot of useful tips and tricks. Most nights were uneventful, and I enjoyed browsing the shelves, reading in my spare time. Sometimes, I would chat with regular patrons who came in late, looking for a good book or a place to study. Really though, I felt like I'd found my dream job. I mean, my college courses did focus on literature, so it wasn't crazy to think that the library could really be my permanent future career. At least, that's what I was thinking, until one night, when everything changed. You see, our library didn't really have a full-time security guard. We did have a guy called Mark. He was our security guard, but he only worked until 6 p.m. After 6, Mark would be done for the day and he would go home, which meant from then until midnight, we would be alone. Honestly, I didn't mind. Why would we need a security guard at the library? It's not like someone would rob us. We barely have any money here, I thought. Unfortunately, I learned the hard way why security guards are very useful at late hours. It was a cold and rainy night. The library was almost empty. I checked the clock, and I saw it was around 11:45 p.m. I started to close things up, so I turned off some of the lights and made an announcement that the library would close in 15 minutes. I walked around the aisles, making sure no one was left behind. As I reached the back of the library, I heard a loud bang coming from the main entrance. It sounded like someone had broken the glass doors. I jumped up and turned around, wondering what on earth it could be. The place was pretty dark by then, due to most of the lights being off now. I slowly approached the place from where the sound came, and I saw him. There was a man standing at the entrance, holding a metal pipe. He was dirty, ragged, and smelled of alcohol. He had this wild look in his eyes, and he was shouting something unintelligible. At first, he didn't really notice me, and he was just standing there at the entrance. I didn't know what to do. I thought about running away or something, but at the same moment, I thought maybe he needed my help. At the end, I decided to ask him if he was all right, a decision I regretted instantly. He looked at me dead serious, didn't say a word, and started to run towards me, swinging that pipe. I was terrified, and I ran to the nearest door, which led to the staff room. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it, hoping that he wouldn't follow me in. Luckily for me, he was very drunk, and he fell over the library chairs a few times. I heard him knocking down the shelves, throwing chairs and books around the room. He was also cursing and yelling. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I whispered that there was an intruder in the library and that I needed help. The operator told me to stay calm. The police were on their way. She asked for my name and location, and I gave her the details. She said she would stay on the line with me until the police arrived. I thanked her and tried to breathe normally. While I was waiting for the police to come, I was constantly hearing the man smashing things and throwing books. I heard glass breaking and metal clanging. I wondered what he was doing and why he was doing it. I prayed he didn't find the doors to the staff room and start breaking in which case he would find me. My heart felt like it would jump out of my chest. My head hurt and I felt sick. Cold sweat was dripping down my forehead. I wondered if I was going to survive. I waited for what seemed like an eternity, praying that the police would come soon. Why would anyone do this? How can someone be so cruel? I thought to myself. The operator kept talking to me, but honestly, I don't remember half the things she said. I was too scared to listen to her. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard them. I heard sirens in the distance, and I felt a surge of relief. In the same moment as the man too heard the sirens. He stopped his rampage and began to run towards the exit. But it was too late for him to escape. The police entered the library and started to chase him down. I heard them shouting, "Stop! Police! Drop your weapon!" I also heard them say, "You're under arrest." At first, I couldn't move. I was thinking about coming outside of the staff room, but I was still so scared. And honestly, I still feared for my life. But moments after his arrest, I heard a policeman on the door say, "Are you okay? Do you hear me?" I unlocked the door and opened it, trembling. "Are you all right? Have you been hurt?" the officer asked. "No, thanks, I'm fine," I replied. As I entered the main room, I became aware of how much damage the drunk guy had done. Most of the shelves in the main room were knocked over. Many of the books had been torn apart. Chairs, desks, lamps, almost everything had been broken. On the other side of the room, I saw 2 officers standing there, holding the man in handcuffs. He was bleeding from his head and had a bruise on his eye. He looked at me with such hatred, and he even tried to spit on me. I flinched and moved away from him. The officers asked me once again if I was hurt, and if I needed medical attention. I repeated I was fine, just shaken up. They said they would take the man to the station, and that I should come with them to file a report. I told them I couldn't come today. I was too shocked. All I wanted was to go back and tell everything to my parents. The police officers were surprisingly very understandable. They said I could come by tomorrow, or later this week. In the meantime, Natasha also came to the crime scene. I think nothing could prepare her for what she saw there. She started crying and shaking. I ran toward her and hugged her. Natasha stayed with the police officers and kept talking with them. She said she would contact me so I could explain to her what happened, and that she knew it wasn't my fault. I felt a wave of sadness and anger wash over me. I still couldn't believe it happened at all. A police officer offered to take me home, and I accepted without hesitation. By the time I got back, my parents were already sleeping. I quickly woke them up and explained what happened. You could see on their faces they were as shocked as I was. I didn't sleep much that night. The following day, Natasha called me, asking me if I wanted to meet with her so I could talk about it. My parents joined me, and together we met with Natasha, who told us that the police explained to her that the man who had broken into the library was a homeless man and that he had caused problems in the past. After our talk, we went into the police station to give our statements. Also, I needed to identify the man one more time. Then I was done. A police officer working there said to me that this time the guy isn't getting out of prison. Despite being happy that this lunatic was moved off the streets, I was still deeply disturbed. The library was closed for a certain period, but I would later quit. My love for books is still here, but I have fears of going back to that library at night. Black Sedan from the X-Ray Man. After finishing high school, I didn't really know what to do. I was thinking about going to college, but nothing really interested me. I knew my parents wouldn't let me stay at home and do nothing. So naturally, I started to look for jobs in my town or in the nearby city. There were a few choices, but all were boring. After a few days of thinking on it, I got an idea. I called up my uncle, who lived in the city near our town and owned a car wash. I'm really into cars. I like to study cars, especially sports cars, and I often watch videos on YouTube of people driving cool rides. Logically, this job seemed interesting to me. I called my uncle. He was delighted when he heard my proposal. He said he really did need some help with the car wash, and he thought it would be a good idea. He added it was a good way for me to earn some money and learn some useful skills. I informed my parents about the job I found, and they agreed with my uncle. On my first day after I arrived at the car wash, I was positively shocked. You see, despite my uncle owning his own car wash, my family didn't really come to the car wash to wash our cars. We usually washed them in our own backyard. Because of that, I'd never really seen his car wash before. When I arrived that day at the place, I was distraught. I knew my uncle had a nice-looking and modern car wash, but I didn't know it was that nice. His place wasn't too big, but it did have 7 stations where you could park your car and wash it. And at least twice as many parking spaces, where you could park your vehicle and polish it after the wash. The car wash had a few of those machines used to inflate the tires, and a small shop where you could buy accessories for your car, like fragrances and such. After I entered the building, I saw my uncle already waiting for me. He hugged me and said he was happy to see me. He showed me around the place, explaining how to work the register, introducing me to different people who worked there. Now, in your typical car wash, you could choose between 2 options. You could do it yourself, or you could have the people there wash it for you. But of course, that would cost more. Among my new coworkers was a guy my age named Tom. He started working at my uncle's place to earn some money for college. We quickly became friends, and I did enjoy working with him. Our work at the wash was interesting and dynamic. Usually, I had to wash, dry, and polish dozens of different cars every day. Some of them were very filthy. Some of them were expensive and gorgeous, and some of them were just old and boring. I tried to target customers with nicer-looking cars, so I could wash them and get a better look. I would often talk with my customers, asking them a lot of questions about their rides. Some folks were nice, some just brushed me off, a lot of folks just wanted to be left alone. Regardless, I would always do my best to clean their vehicles. A few nice folks would recognize the job I did and even tip me. Also, sometimes I would work at the register, but that part of my job was boring to me. I came there to see cars and learn something, not to count money at the register. During my lunch breaks, I would often talk with Tom. I bonded with the guy quick, as he too was very interested in cars, though he didn't have one of his own yet. He wanted to buy one after finishing college. A lot of our conversations were automobile-related, specifically about the one he wanted to buy for himself. For the most part, I worked morning shifts from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. I liked the work schedule because I had plenty of free time after coming here. For the first few months of working there, everything was going perfectly. I enjoyed it, and my uncle was satisfied with me. And hey, the pay wasn't bad. But neither me nor my uncle were prepared for the event that would happen to us one day at work. That day, while I was doing my regular chores, a man came in with a black sedan. I greeted him as usual, asking him how I could help. He looked nervous, like he was in a hurry. He quickly handed me the keys and said he wanted the full service. He said he'd be back in an hour, instructing me that I had to be quick. He didn't even give me the time to take his name or phone number. He just left. What was that about? I thought. Seems these wealthier folks are always in a hurry. I wasted no time. I took his car over to the washing station. I didn't want to disappoint him, and I was hoping for a nice tip. I sprayed the car with water and soap and proceeded to scrub it with a sponge. I then noticed the car had some dents and scratches on the body. After I washed the exterior, I moved on to the interior, vacuuming the seats and floor. Then I decided to clean the trunk. As I vacuumed the trunk, I realized something strange. The bottom of the trunk felt odd, almost as if it were fake. I turned the vacuum cleaner off, deciding to take a closer look. My suspicions proved to be true. It was indeed a false bottom. I took off the cover and moved it aside. As I looked into the trunk, I couldn't believe what I saw inside of it. There was a pistol there, next to a few bags filled with some kind of white powder or substance. Immediately, I thought they were drugs. My legs began to shake a bit, and I started to breathe heavy. It was then that Tom came up to check on me. "What's going on, man?" he asked. "Come see this, dude," I could barely say. He took a peek inside the trunk too, quickly losing his smile. I suggested we call my uncle. I mean, we were basically just kids. What could we do? As we walked over to my uncle's office, I checked the time, and I saw it had almost been an hour. I was hoping we could avoid the man, or that the police could show up before him, but then I saw him entering our car wash. My heart began to go crazy. Then I noticed the man was bleeding. He had a wound on his chest and blood on his shirt. He looked both scared and furious. He ran to his car and began to look in the trunk. He noticed we had removed the fake bottom. He made this horrific scream. He yelled curses and obscenities, screaming about how dare I touch his stuff, asking do I know who I'm even dealing with. Then he grabbed the gun from the trunk and began to shoot towards me and Tom. Luckily, he missed. At that moment, I completely lost it. I didn't know where I was, I didn't know what was happening. But luckily, Tom was nearby, and he dragged me inside. Seeing that he had missed, the crazy man got even angrier. He started to shoot all around, alerting all of my coworkers, including my uncle, and starting a panic amongst the people nearby. Tom and I hid under the desk when my uncle came out of his office. "The heck is going on?" he asked. I wanted to explain the situation, but I just couldn't talk. All I could think about was my family and the fact that I didn't want to die. At that moment, we all heard another vehicle come in. We looked outside. There was a red car speeding into the parking lot. It stopped right in front of the black sedan, and two men got out. They wore masks and carried baseball bats. They looked angry too, and violent. They quickly rushed over to the owner of the black sedan, and sadly for him, he had used all his bullets shooting around the car wash. The two men swung their bats at him and started to hit him. He fell to the ground, dropping his gun. I could hear him groaning as he crawled, but they kept hitting him. As they beat him, I almost threw up. Again, I could not believe what was going on. After beating the man, they smashed the windows of the black sedan and approached the trunk. They took the bags of powder, putting them all into a big black bag. After taking the supposed drugs, they started to run back to their car. As they ran over, one of them looked directly at me. As I looked him in the eyes, the blood in my veins froze. I quickly sat down and tried not to cry. This can't be happening, can it? I thought. Was that man going to come in here and kill all of us? But at that moment, as I was panicking, just as my uncle began to call the police, I heard sirens. I don't know how, but I gathered a little courage, stood up, looked again outside the window, and saw flashing lights from police cars. The police had arrived. They surrounded the scene. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, those two masked men had escaped. Quickly after the police, an ambulance arrived too. After they secured the place, they started to talk with us. I sat with Tom inside an ambulance, still shaking, when the officers approached us. Tom and I told everything that we could. After giving our statements, I asked them what happened to the owner of the black sedan. They told me he'd been killed. Those two masked men had beaten him to death with baseball bats. Shortly after the police left, my uncle came to visit us. He asked if we were doing okay. He then called both our families so someone could come and pick us up. He added that, sadly, the owner of the black sedan had killed and badly injured two of our coworkers. My uncle tried to act brave in front of us, but I could see it in his face. He was shocked and scared and sad. After this incident, I couldn't really sleep that well. I kept having nightmares about the event for weeks. Ultimately, my parents and I agreed that I should visit a psychiatrist so he could talk with me, trying to help me get over that nightmare. Eventually, I got better, and I was able to move past it. In the meantime, my uncle decided to close his car wash. He reopened it in a new location, far from the old one. I felt so sorry for him. Not only did he experience all that trauma, but even worse, he felt responsible for all of it. My parents had talked with him and said it wasn't his fault, but he kept blaming himself for what happened. We didn't really talk much after that, and I didn't hear from Tom much either. Police officers visited us a few times to ask me if I remembered any new information about the event, and to inform us that they didn't have any new leads about the two masked men. To this day, they didn't find and arrest either of them. To this day, no suspects have been found or arrested. A year after that, I decided to go to college. I enrolled in a radiology college, and I decided to become a radiology technician. But even after all this time, one thing is still driving me crazy and keeping me nervous all the time. That man with the mask, the one who looked right at me, he saw my face while he was running to his car. That man is still out there. He's free, and he can find me whenever he wants, and he can hurt me and my family. Terrifying work stories from my family and friends. From Cricket Girl 20. These stories come from my uncle, his wife, and their daughter. The first comes from his wife, my Aunt Elle. Elle worked at a group home for 2 years. She said a lot of terrifying things happened during her shifts, but 2 occasions in particular will always stand out to her. She worked the evening shift, and one night, one of the residents was being quite rowdy. 2 other staff members were trying to calm him down. Elle decided to see if she could help them. When she went to the hallway, she saw the resident running full speed at her with a screwdriver. This caught her off guard, and she couldn't move fast enough. The resident knocked her down. Other staff members pulled him off, and he was yelling, "I have to get rid of the evil." Elle just sat up and leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The cops were called, and they took him to a hospital to be evaluated. Turns out the resident was a schizophrenic, and his parents never mentioned it when they brought him to the group home. Elle was given some time off after that. She doesn't really blame the young man. Warning: this next story contains mentions of assault. The next story gives me chills when she or I tell it. It was a rainy night. Elle was covering for a fellow staff member who called in sick. It was mostly quiet, besides the rain hitting the windows and the hum of a refrigerator. She suddenly heard a knock on the front door. Now, this group home looked like a regular house, and it was on the outskirts of town. There weren't that many other houses on the road, so when Elle heard the knock, she was a little freaked out. She looked out the peephole, and she saw a man standing on the porch. She opened the inner door, leaving the screen door locked. She asked, "Hello, can I help you?" The man said, "I'm trying to sell these electronics. Would you like to buy any?" Elle had a creepy feeling about the guy and replied, "No, thank you." She closed the door, double-checked to make sure it was locked, then looked at the clock. It was 1 a.m. She got even more freaked out, asking herself, why on earth would someone come all the way out here trying to sell some electronics at 1 a.m.? She checked on the residents, then sat back down. About 7 minutes later, she began to hear noises coming from a monitor that was in one of the rooms where a resident was sleeping. This resident wasn't able to talk. he was able to make sounds whenever he wanted attention or something else. When Elle looked at the monitor, she felt her heart skip a beat. She saw on the screen a man was in the resident's room, violating the resident. Her motherly instinct kicked in, and she grabbed the baseball bat that was kept by the stairs and ran to the room. But the man was already out the window that he had come in from. The boss was already on the way once her phone got a notification from the monitor. When she arrived, Elle was comforting the resident. She told the boss what happened, but the boss's reaction was different than what she expected. The boss did not want to alert the police, but Elle said, "Screw that." She called the police anyway. Due to disobeying her boss, Elle was fired. But Elle didn't regret it. She knew she had done the right thing. She alerted the residents' parents to what happened, and they removed their son from the group home. Elle says, "I wouldn't have done it any other way." This next story comes from my uncle. I'll call him B. B worked as a repairman. One day he got a call from a man who needed his bathroom sink fixed. B drove out to the house, which was apparently out in the country. My uncle is from the city, so he was just hoping the man wouldn't look at him like he was crazy. Once he arrived at the house, he was confused. The place looked abandoned. He walked on up to the door, and before he knocked, he felt like he needed to run. He wasn't sure why, but he listened to the feeling and began to run back to his truck. The moment he shut his truck door, the door to the house swung open, and a man came running out holding a machete. B sped away and reported it to the police. The police called him back a day later. They told him that the house had been abandoned for 10 years. B gets goosebumps when he tells this story. The next story comes from my aunt and uncle's daughter, S. She works at Goodwill. She loves the job, but has had a few scary experiences there. The one that stands out to her the most was when she was walking home from work one night. She had one earbud in and was listening to music when she suddenly felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She looked behind her, and that's when she spotted a figure walking behind her. She got a little spooked and began to walk faster, but then the figure started to yell at her. She texted her brother C, saying, "Someone is following me. Can Dad come pick me up?" C texted back, "Where are you at?" She told him what street she was on, and he and their dad began to drive to her. Suddenly, she felt a hand grab her arm and began to pull her back. She started screaming for help. Just as suddenly, a middle-aged man came out of his house holding a shotgun and yelling, "Let her go!" while his Rottweiler came running out the door, charging at the person. This person ran off, and the man asked, "Are you okay?" She shook her head. The man and his dog stayed with us until her brother and dad drove up. Her dad thanked the man, and they drove home together. S didn't walk home anymore after that. It really traumatized her, but she doesn't let it keep her down, and I'm happy she's okay. These two final stories come from two of my friends. We'll call them Jay and Kayla. Jay worked at a Wendy's for a while, and one night he had decided to walk the long way to work. As he's walking, two men began to yell homophobic slurs at him. Jay is bi, and normally he wouldn't let anyone's mean words hurt him. But these men didn't stop there. They suddenly started to chase him. Jay is no runner, but that night he found the speed he needed. He made it to work, asking his boss if she could call the cops. Oddly enough, she told him, "No, as if you're the only person that's happened to." When he told me that, my godmother and I had a meeting with his boss. We made it clear to her that Jay felt like he had been targeted, and when an employee tells you that they were chased, you call the cops when asked to. She apologized, but the damage was done. Jay quit working there the next day. Kayla's story isn't as scary as the others, but to her it was quite scary. She worked at a Brahms ice cream, and one night she called me and asked me if I could walk her home after her shift was over. She told me that a man had come in and had been asking her uncomfortable questions. He just kept staring at her. I told her, "Sure, me and my godfather Scotty will come pick you up." We drove into the parking lot, and we saw her waiting outside, and this man was trying to touch her. Scotty and I quickly walked up, telling him, "You'd better leave her alone." Scotty grabbed Kayla by her arm, saying, "Let's go." But the guy tried following, but Scotty made sure to show the man his concealed firearm. The man backed up and walked away. Kayla thanked us a lot. She spent the night at my apartment, so she didn't have to be alone. Kayla quit working there because the guy just kept coming and messing with her. She and Jay now work together at a daycare, and they enjoy it there. My friend's experiences as a police officer. From Cricket Girl 20. From the ages of 21 through 24, my friend Oliver was a police officer. He was older than me, but we were close. He would often tell me about his job, about the good and the bad. But when he turned 23, something changed. One night at around 1:30 a.m., he knocked on my door. It startled me awake. I opened the door and said, "Goodness, Oliver, it's the middle of the night. You okay?" My tone of voice changed when I saw the look on his face. I told him to come in, and he sat down on the couch. I gave him some hot chocolate and asked him, "What's wrong, Oliver?" He rotated the mug in his hand for a bit, then said, "Abby left me." I sat there for a second. Then he started to cry. I pulled him in for a hug and asked, "Why did she leave?" He sat back up, wiped his tears, and replied, "Because of my experiences on patrols, I've been seeing things. Well, a ghost, I think." I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Well, tell me about these experiences." He looked at me and hesitated for a minute. Then he began. "Well, it started when we responded to a call of a young lady whose car got flipped. By the time my partner and I arrived, the car was in flames. I tried getting her out, but the heat was too much, and I had no choice but to take cover as the car exploded. I was upset, but I knew I couldn't do anything about it. After that, well, I started to see her everywhere. And she would always have this evil look on her face. I think she was angry with me. The first time I saw her was at home that same night. I just got finished showering, and when I opened the shower curtain, for a split second, I saw her. But she was gone so quickly. When I told Abby, she just said I was seeing things. She started to pop up at the department, the store, even the doctor's office. The second time I saw her was at the department. I was in the bathroom when I looked in the mirror, and I saw her there with that same evil look on her face. I even told my partner, and he laughed, saying, "Dude, you just feel guilty." The next day I saw her in my bedroom. Maybe it was a dream, but I don't think it was. She spoke to me then. She said,
You let me die. Now I will take something from you.
That night, my partner and I had the night patrol. We were driving down this dirt road when a man ran across the road, causing me to slam on my brakes. This man ran off into an abandoned house. Worried, the two of us ran after him. We split up, but a couple of minutes later, I heard a gunshot. I ran to make sure my partner was okay. I found him on the ground, a bullet wound to the chest, That man had shot my partner and ran off. I radioed for backup and held my partner in my arms. He said one last thing to me, asking me to tell his mom he loved her. Then he passed away. I felt someone in the room with me then, and when I looked up, I saw that same girl, the same evil grin on her face. She whispered, "Now I've taken something from you." I went home later that night, drowning my sorrows in whiskey. Abby hugged me and said she was sorry. I went back to work a week after and kept seeing her everywhere I went. I was constantly going to the bar. My supervisor told me I needed to take more time off. I did, but it did nothing to ease the pain of losing my partner. Abby was too busy working to listen to me, and I didn't want to burden you at the time. I requested to be a solo officer. I didn't want to have a new partner just yet. One night while on patrol, I looked in the back seat and I found her there, smiling that awful grin. I slammed on the brakes so fast. I then looked in the back seat and saw that she was gone. I even tried going to a therapist, but it didn't do any good. This all happened a year ago, and I'm still seeing her. I should have saved her. Abby finally had enough of me complaining about it. She broke up with me. I didn't know where else to come tonight. After he finished telling me his story, I gave him a hug again and said, "Oliver, listen, you did everything you could to save her, and I'm sorry with what happened with Abby. I don't think she understood what you were going through, but I think you're a great guy." Oliver fell asleep on my couch. Soon after that, he quit the force. He turned in his gun and badge, and eventually, he did stop seeing the woman. It was so good seeing him happy again. Unfortunately, not too long ago, Oliver passed away from cancer. By the time it was detected, it was too late for him. Before passing, Oliver got a dog to help him with his troubles. He made me promise if anything happened to him that I would take the dog, and I kept that promise. Sometimes I can sense Oliver is around me, and I miss him every day.
Abducted while on duty, from James I. In the early 2000s, I became a sheriff's deputy in a small rural town, where I'd grown up most of my life. I was quite young and immature, but I responded to many calls which, over time, taught me a lot about people and life. One call, though, deeply changed my life, and forever affected how I would look at the world. It all started around 8 p.m. when I received a call from my dispatcher, notifying me of an individual who was in distress. The caller was described as an elderly woman who lived alone and was concerned about aliens that were outside her window, trying to steal her cats. Being the closest one in the area, I took the call, preparing to deal with the issue. I received multiple calls similar to this one before, and they were usually a prank or a mentally ill individual who needed some help. I might have even laughed a bit at this as I drove to the scene, thinking of how silly it would be for aliens to fly across the galaxy only to break into someone's home to steal their cats. I arrived at the property sometime after 8 and slowly made my way onto a private gravel road, which led to a large house a few hundred feet into the distance. It was this huge, secluded property with lots of grass and shrubs, but I could definitely make out a couple of lit windows on the second floor. As I made my way closer, I came upon a fence in the middle of the road that blocked my car, so I had to continue on foot. I walked for a minute or two, all the while scanning my surroundings for potential burglars, or so-called aliens, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As I continued, something strange started to happen to me. I began to feel this warm, tingling sensation emanating from my body, as if a pot of hot water were being steamed away from inside my chest. I also began to smell this heavy metallic odor, sort of like if old pennies were mixed with chlorine. I paused to catch my breath and to think about why I was feeling this way, when suddenly, this huge glowing object appeared from the backside of the house. I froze in shock, and every possible thought raced through my mind at once. The object ascended over the roof, where it silently hovered for a few seconds, and then it made its way to the front of the house, where it remained floating a couple of feet above the ground. It looked like an orange hockey puck that was stretched out vertically to make space for whatever might have been inside. At this point, I felt my throat starting to burn, and I began to cough. I immediately attempted to let the dispatcher know what I was seeing, but my radio was going crazy with static thumps and whatnot. Out of nowhere, I saw this bright flash, which caused my brain to feel like it was exploding. I woke up back in my patrol car, which was stuck at the front gate. I looked around wondering how the heck I got here. I felt extremely nauseous and stumbled out of my car in a daze. I was clearly just standing next to the house a second ago. I looked around for any signs of the object I'd seen, but it was as if it disappeared into thin air. I then noticed that my dispatcher was calling me on the radio, so I quickly responded. She inquired as to why I wasn't answering her for the past 20 minutes, which startled and confused me even more. I told her that I spoke with her only 2 minutes ago as I approached the house, but she insisted that we did not speak for almost half an hour. I couldn't remember anything after approaching the home, but when I talked to the elderly woman who lived there, she claimed that she saw me from her bedroom window, falling to the ground and being approached by these short, alien beings. She also claimed to have been abducted by them many times before, and to have been taken to a dimly lit room to be scanned. For days after the incident, I was told every possible explanation under the sun, and experienced strange looks to whoever I told it to. I've since realized not to involve it in my personal or professional life. I did, however, have a few nightmares about the whole encounter, scenes where these alien-looking beings were talking to me. But to this day, I'm not 100% sure what happened that night. All I know for a fact is that I am missing approximately 20 minutes of my time.
Warning. The following story contains depictions of violence and harm against children. I have seen the face of evil. From Michigan Deputy. I work as a sheriff's office deputy in Michigan. At the time these stories took place, I was working for a department near central Michigan. To protect the families and victims of these stories, I will not disclose the exact area this occurred. I've been a deputy for 5 years. In that time, I've responded to every type of call possible, from noise complaints to triple homicides. I worked for an urban department that borders one of Michigan's largest cities. I use the past tense here because I recently moved to another sheriff's department in a different area of the state. Naturally, I've encountered all kinds of people. I expected this, as the basis of police work is talking to new people every day, gathering information on them, as well as the situation that caused them to call for police services. The changes day to day keep me on my toes, and are one of the aspects of this job I enjoy the most. But I never thought I would encounter someone that truly struck me as evil. To make this story make sense and help you understand my perspective on it, I need to give some background info about myself. I was raised in a very religious household. My parents made my sisters and I attend church every Sunday, attend Bible school before or after the service, enrolled us in vacation Bible schools over the summer, paid for us to go to Christian summer camps, etc. The older I've gotten, I've struggled with organized religion and a lot of the shame and guilt doctrines that were drilled into me as a kid. I'm still generally spiritual. I believe God exists, as I do with angels, demons, the devil, and so forth. But I do not attend church currently, and I don't subscribe to any specific religion. I know evil exists in this world, but I always thought it existed in the acts people do, the poor choices people make occasionally, and that at heart, everyone has good in them. 2 calls for service in 2019 and 2021 changed the way I see people permanently. The first call was in the late fall of 2019. My partners and I got dispatched to a shots-fired call at a local dive motel. Dispatch had gotten reports of a shooting in the parking lot, with one victim lying face down in the middle of the lot. The shooter was running back towards their room. We arrived on scene, located the victim, secured a perimeter, and began to render aid to the victim. I always carry lots of medical gear in my car, and I was therefore tasked with basic patient care until EMS arrived. I rolled the victim over onto his back, and for the first time, I saw the life leave someone's body. I saw his chest decompress, heard what sounded like his final breath leave his body, and I watched as the light behind his eyes dimmed away as I attempted to locate where he was shot. Unfortunately, there was nothing I nor EMS could do to save this man's life. I learned later that the bullet had entered on the bottom right side of his ribcage and traveled upward at a 45-degree angle, piercing right through his heart. After EMS tended to the victim, my sergeant tasked me and one of my partners to go to the suspect's room, which we had ascertained from witnesses on the scene. We got to the room and opened the door that was already ajar. Standing in the middle of the room was the suspect, with his wife and 3 children. The suspect had his hands up with a cold, calm, emotionless look on his face. His wife and children were crying hysterically. We ordered the suspect to point to where the gun was, and he pointed to it, lying right in the middle of the room, completely unsecured. He hadn't even tried to hide the gun, never made a move like he was going to try to escape being taken into custody. At this point in my career, at the time of the case, I never had someone accused of such a heinous crime be so cooperative. The suspect was taken into custody without issue and transported to our department headquarters for lodging at the jail and interviews with the detectives. After all the work for the case was completed a few days later, I watched the tape of the detectives interviewing the suspect. He admitted to everything, not hiding a single detail. And the whole time he talked in a calm, smooth, controlled voice, like he wasn't actually present in his own body as he explained what he did to kill this man. The entire time the detectives interacted with him, the suspect gave off a weird energy that spooked me a little bit. I could tell he had no remorse for what he'd done. It was like he didn't care about another human in the slightest. This second call for service happened in 2021. It started as a slow night. I was sitting at one of my normal traffic points, watching for any good stops. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life, and 2 of my partners got sent to a call of a completed suicide. The initial report was that the wife came home to find her husband dead in their bedroom. Seeing as it was a slow night, and these kinds of calls usually take a while, I decided to start heading that way to help my partners get done more quickly. As I began driving, dispatch gave out more information, which deeply disturbed me. They were changing the nature of the call to a murder-suicide. The caller had now reported that her 2 children, ages 4 and 6, were dead, along with her husband inside the home. Everyone available in my department began responding to the scene now. When I arrived, I was the second one there. As I put the cruiser in park, I could see my partner running across the front lawn into the home to get to the children. As I ran across the lawn as well, medical bag in hand, the same partner came running out of the house with the limp body of a 6-year-old boy in his arms. We locked eyes, and he shouted, "He's still breathing!" We began tending to the little boy as more officers and EMS arrived on scene. Seeing more people were going to come help, I left my partner on the lawn and retrieved the female caller, who was identified as the stepmother to the children and wife to the deceased male inside. Initially, when I pulled her aside to make sure she didn't re-enter the house and crime scene, she was crying. But I didn't see any tears. She was trying to scream like she was in pain, but it seemed like she was acting. Her emotions didn't seem right. They looked rehearsed, scripted, embellished, like she wanted me to believe she was hurting when she really wasn't. I escorted her to a chair on the porch so we could keep an eye on her while tending to the victims and getting the scene secured. My sergeant tasked me with another job, so I went inside the house for a little bit. When I came back outside, I saw the female was not in the chair I'd set her in. I asked one of the other deputies where she was, and no one seemed to know. After a couple of minutes, we found her sitting in her recliner inside the residence. The angle at which I entered the room she was in allowed me to see what she was doing on her phone. She was on Facebook, commenting on one of her friend's posts about a recent vacation. I stopped for a second and listened. This woman was calm. I did not hear any heavy breathing, any sniffling, like would normally occur after crying. She wasn't showing any kind of behavior, indicating she was grieving or worried about her family. She wasn't calling her parents, she wasn't calling loved ones to tell them what happened, to ask for support. She was completely unbothered. Through the course of the night, I had several more encounters with her, and every time she seemed to lack emotion. Her effect was the same as the man from the homicide I described in the first story, completely emotionless. And as the case was further investigated, I was informed by the lead detective that she was most likely the killer. Evidence was found in the house indicating her marriage was troubled, and journal entries detailing how she wanted out of her marriage so she could move to Texas and start a life with the woman she was having an affair with were found. As of writing this, the case is not officially closed, but all evidence currently points to the female killing her own family. To this day, I believe I encountered two people who were the closest things to real-life demons I've ever seen. I've seen the worst of people's behavior in my career so far, but these two calls stand out as a league of their own. Even a man raging drunk with some sort of other substance in his system that just assaulted his family was nowhere near as terrifying as these two homicide suspects. These two people did not even seem human to me. They had human form, human appearance, and were in all likelihood human genetically. But what they did, how they acted, so cold and detached and unapologetic, that was all anything but human. I still believe everyone has good in them, but now I also believe everyone has some evil in them too. Some have more evil than others. Stay safe out there.
Horrifying experience as a cop. An account shared with us by Mythology Loves Horror. I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, acing my exams and tests. It wasn't long before I had a job offer after my official graduation. Despite the job being across the country, I eagerly took a flight and flew over, wanting to be seen as dependable and excited. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or angry bull moose don't kill you, then there's still plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainer at the state police barracks in Newport, I thought it'd be all pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup, but I was wrong. I originally came from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough woman, but I know now that I'm woefully unequipped to handle everything out there. I don't think anyone's equipped to handle a situation like this one. The call that started this experience should have been a standard domestic abuse case, but it turned into something else. In the 3.5 years that I've been there, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished by fallen trees, cars that had been totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought all that was bad enough, but I was not prepared to find myself in a situation that I could not logic my way out of. I didn't have any paperwork left to do that Saturday, and because I'm trained in the field, I asked my friend Officer T if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse call that had just come in. His partner had already gone home for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out to the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement. I hadn't gone out in the field in a few months, and I'd been itching for some action now, especially since my most recent class had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining them into my mind. We were to speak with a Mr. B who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I drove for about 15 minutes, and eventually we found ourselves on one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was nearly up to our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. We cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch black out. It was a concerned neighbor who had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the houses. We'd been under the impression that the fighting had been occurring inside her neighbor's house, but apparently that was not the case. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard screams. They were very hard to describe. They sounded like a strangely pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted for about 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was saying actual words. It was more a cry of sheer terror, stuck on an infinite loop. My adrenaline was pumping so hard that I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. Protocol dictates that we could go next door and question the suspect, but under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize their safety over standard inquiries. This being the case, we sprinted from the porch, making our way as quickly and carefully as we could towards that awkward sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams. Each of them getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved, and as we made our way deeper into the woods, we quietly discussed whether or not we thought it was an animal or a person. The screams of a mountain lion can sound just like those of a distressed woman, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally beginning to approach the creek bed, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We had begun calling out for someone to come forward if they were there, or to help lead us to whoever was hurt, but there was no other sounds. I had been checking for footprints, but there were only ours and deer tracks. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage, But even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area and hadn't seen any signs of a blood trail or struggle. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car when the air around us erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomenon that I was, and then we heard an exact copy of that scream from when we were on the porch. It came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate. And then there was a chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear his footsteps crunching for a long time, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split moment, I thought that I saw his eyes shine bright yellow in the beam from my flashlight. I dismissed that thought, knowing that the glint of snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him that we needed to get out of here. He looked almost angry for a moment, then he crossed the clearing to me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he had been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right. I nearly screamed out loud. That was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arm and all but dragged him back through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his bicep so that he wouldn't stumble again. I was 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get us through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we got halfway back to the house, the scream came again, this time sounding like it was right next to me. In a panic, I frantically shone my flashlight around in every direction to find it, to find what we were being pursued by. But there was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was not even a glint of animal eyes, no rustling of bushes, no sounds of footfalls, just tense silence after that scream. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air. But I swear, I heard it calling my name. By then, I was too horrified to go back out there. I tried my best to keep my wits about me, enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. But she never did call again, and the officer who did a follow-up the next day did not report anything unusual. That night, I got Officer T and I out of there as fast as the cruiser would go, and I don't regret that choice. I still have no idea what was in those woods, but as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animal makes that kind of wail. Whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, telling me that I should be glad I got out of there alive. He says that the danger that night was closer than I knew. I think only he knows how close of a call it was.
Late Night Park Visit from PX 5389. I'll start off by saying I live in a suburban setting in a small town. Unlike me, my friend had lived in a more rural section of the county at the time. This incident took place near my house. My friend's name is Ryan. He and I have certainly witnessed a whole bunch of wild crap throughout our time of being friends, and this experience was certainly memorable for its unnatural turnout. I met Ryan about a month before this occurrence happened. As funny as it sounds, we actually met through the twins we were dating. Who knew that our long-dead relationships with them sparked the friendship between two like-minded, adrenaline junkie individuals,
that's lasted to this day. This happened back in the summer after freshman year of high school. As any other day of summer, we had made it our goal to make the most out of the time off from school. One late night during a summer sleepover, we figured, what better way to have a fun summer than to sneak out to the park at midnight? So that's exactly what we did. I live in a small neighborhood which connects to the village I live in. This park is in a relatively desolate area of the village, so there isn't much foot traffic going through that area, especially at night. Something about sneaking out just made each of us really excited, and we could hardly contain ourselves. We figured we'd have the opportunity to mess with a couple having fun in their car, or better yet, find some shady people to stalk, just for the heck of it. Don't ask me why we thought this was a good idea. The only reason I have is moronic teenager behavior. I know at least one of you felt the same way we did at one point in your lives. Looking back, it was dumb. But then again, if we didn't do something stupid like this, we would have no good stories to share. Anyway, we were hanging in my basement. My parents had recently had it finished, and one of the safety requirements was an escape latch. To us, that escape latch was our way of getting out and not being caught. It worked perfectly, and I've resorted to using it ever since when needed. Before we left, I made sure we brought a basketball along, because I knew that during the summer the park hosted a camp, and they put up a basketball hoop for campers to use. As we climbed out of my basement, we were exposed to the hot night air. One problem we had were the mosquitoes. The dang suckers were everywhere we walked. As we walked onto the sidewalk, we started to have a conversation along the lines of, wait until the twins hear what we did tonight. At the time, we thought we were savages, but now I realize we were just impulsive teenagers that were way over their heads. Before I continue, it's crucial that I give you a good idea of how the park looks. There's a traditionally paved road that leads to the parking lot, all the way on the other side of the park. We, however, had come through the neighborhood, which has a rough dirt path that we would usually bike on during the day. As we walked across this dirt path, there were baseball fields on either sides of us, with their dugouts empty. We continued to walk, wary of our surroundings, until we made our way to the dimly lit pavilion. Next to the pavilion was one area with playground equipment. This was often referred to as the little kids area. The parking lot connected to the pavilion and this playground. About a quarter mile down the parking lot was the big kids area, with more complex equipment. This area was located much closer to the entrance of the park. The big kids area connected to the parking lot, and a gigantic soccer field, which stretched all the way to where the pavilion was located. Seeing this field in its uninhabited state put both of us in a feeling of unease. We made jokes about something possibly being out there watching us from the field. Obviously, they were just jokes, though. We had actually not seen anything. But saying we did scared the heck out of each of us, nonetheless. For now, we were just sitting in the pavilion, listening to music and talking about future plans with our girls. Those were certainly some nostalgic times. I couldn't help but look back towards the field every so often, just out of paranoia that someone or something might be out there. Nothing ever showed. After about an hour of just chilling, we figured we would make our way down to the basketball court. To be as descriptive as possible, we made our way across the main parking lot area down to where the big kid area of the park was. Instead of going straight, which would lead to the exit of the park, we made a right to the parking lot, which exposed a whole other area of unused parking spaces. This extended about a half mile down. All the way at the bottom of the parking lot was the basketball hoop, along with dense forest which surrounds the area of the sector of the parking lot. Now, before we made our way completely down, I stopped and I told my friend to stand still. A faint car outline was visible in the furthest corner of the area. This instantly caused us to become suspicious. The car was black, which only made it blend in more with the night. What made us more curious was the fact that the outline was not that of a police car. Instead of turning back like normal people, we continued on our merry way right down to the basketball hoop. I guess we were just testing this person to see what they would do. There's that typical untouchable macho kid stereotype again. Their car was completely off, and had been for the past hour, which we assumed because no one had driven into the park while we were there. At first, I figured they must be lovers, but no. There was no one in the passenger seat, and the only light illuminating from within the car now seemed to be that of a phone screen. This hoop was a few yards away from the car, which we thought was a safe distance away. We decided if anything went south, we would book it back to the pavilion by cutting through the field, which we really didn't want to do, but if it came down to it, we'd have to. We started to play some basketball for a few minutes, but as time went by, we only became more unsettled. The fact that this person was sitting in their car unbothered by us made us each on edge. Instead of shooting around, we had begun to occasionally dribble the ball, while just staring at the car in our peripheral vision. During an interval of my friend dribbling the ball, I could swear I heard the evermost slight crack of the car driver's side door opening. I told my friend to quit it, and we each stared at the car waiting for something to happen. We were silent. A few moments passed, and at this point nothing happened. Now sort of teed off that this guy was ruining our time, I yelled some profanities his way, and foolishly threatened to call the police, which I was quite sure he heard. Right after I finished, the car engine came to life, and the car began to violently back out of the spot it was parked in. It was truly disturbing how a night so silent had turned into an episode of screeching tires and burning rubber. As soon as this guy began to back out, that's when me and my friend booked it. We ran up the little hill that led to the field and hopped the fence. Screw whatever imaginary cryptid could be stalking us in the field. Right now, the main priority was to get away from this lunatic in their car. As we made our way through the field, we saw the car driving full speed right out of the parking lot and out of the park. We were left in the confusion, not even knowing what to think. So many questions had been running through my mind. Had that guy just tried to run us over? Why had he been in such a hurry to leave? What if we hadn't run to the soccer field in time? What if I hadn't noticed him open the door ever so slightly? All these questions have remained unanswered to this day. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. This wasn't even the most freakish part of the night. That is yet to come. As we had made our way back to the pavilion, we sat down on one of the benches and sat in complete silence for a few minutes, contemplating what just happened. After just sitting there for a few minutes, we started to just talk again, watching the entrance to the park, just in case anyone drove in. We sat there for a decent amount of time until Ryan suddenly whispered to me, "Dude, check it. Is that someone on the swings?" My stomach sank. On the other side of the park, where the big kid area was, we saw a dark figure. We watched closely as the silhouette went up and down. We fell silent, studying what was right in front of us. What really spooked me was the distant yet familiar sound of that rusty chain swinging slowly back and forth. I got goosebumps as I picked up on the sound. How could someone have gotten there without us noticing, especially if they had not come through the neighborhood entrance or road entrance? This wasn't one of those cliches where as soon as you notice the thing, it stops doing whatever it's doing and looks you dead in the eye and comes towards you. No. Instead, my friend decided to yell out to them. That's right. He literally said, "Hey, you want to play some basketball?" Whoever we were looking at stopped swinging and looked in our general direction. I was on the verge of punching Ryan so hard in the mouth for what he just said. I told him, "Dude, what the heck? What if he runs towards us?" He simply replied, "Don't worry, bro. He's outnumbered, and we have pocket knives." As I recall that line now, I cringe so hard, fully understanding what clowns we were. It's honestly comical to a certain degree when you take out the potentially life-threatening dude that was only a sprinting distance away from us. But no, that figure didn't advance towards us. They didn't make a sound. All they did was get up off the swing and head into the small bathroom facility that was located right next to the park area. They were hooded, and we only saw the back of them as they went in. Judging by stature, this person looked tall and lanky. Me and my friend were officially freaked out, but we stood there in anticipation for a few minutes just waiting. 10 minutes passed, and we had been staring right at the door the person had entered, waiting for the door to open again. A few minutes after that, the door swung open. The same individual came out, but they faced us this time. We were able to distinguish their face. Their eyes were enormous, and their hair was a wild mess across their face and beneath their hood. At first, I was confused and thought we were looking at a complete freak. I was so disturbed. I looked down at the mouth, and it was twisted in this horrific, static grimace. That's when I realized it must have been a mask. Thinking about it now, it reminded me very much of that Momo character that was hyped up a few years back. They gave a quick wave in our direction and motioned us to follow. It was a quick glance I got because as soon as this person came out of the bathroom, they swung to their side and walked towards the end of the parking lot, where the basketball hoop was. To give a better image of this parking lot, it was forked into two areas. If you were coming from the park road entrance, you could either go straight towards the pavilion or take a left and go down into the bigger parking lot which extended to where the basketball hoop was, closely followed by the tree line. My friend and I stood and watched as this figure continued their way, not looking back at us. We weren't sure of what to do. We just sat there, stunned. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the figure had broken into a full-on sprint heading right into the woods. That's when we noticed the headlight beams appearing at the entrance of the park. We saw the grill and realized it was a police officer. He continued driving towards us. As opposed to most people, we were actually relieved to see him come our way. He got out of his car and in a stern voice asked us what we were doing out at this hour. We replied, just hanging out. The officer told us it would be best if we went home, that if he catches us here again at this time, he would escort us home himself. He was stern yet considerate, and we appreciated that. After he said this, I asked if he had seen that person running into the woods on his way into the park. He replied no, and asked us if we were under the influence, clearly skeptical. We quickly said no and asked if there were any security cameras in the park. He said, "Yeah, that's how I knew you were here." Then it hit me there were other security cameras that had been scattered throughout the park. I asked if any of them were recording, to which he responded, "Only one that's working right now is the one located in the pavilion." This disappointed us greatly and left us with a feeling of dread. He asked us a few more questions, then sent us on our way, making sure we left the park. Once we'd gotten back to my house, we had snuck back in through the basement escape hatch. We discussed what happened, both of us shaken. The following day, we walked back to the park at noon, when there were other people around. We went over to the bathroom that had been used by that person the other night. Nothing seemed wrong, but on our way out, Ryan caught a glimpse of the garbage can and said, "Hold up." Curious, I turned around and we both looked. In the garbage was that mask the person had used, or at least what used to be the mask. It appeared to have been cut up and ripped apart with something. After that, we left in a hurry. Ever since that day, we haven't really went to the park, period. It just sketched us out too much and we didn't want anything to do with it. Sure, it's a crazy memory to share, but honestly, retelling the story in its entirety has given me goosebumps and a feeling of anxiety, traveling back in my mind to the night this happened, knowing how dangerous it could have been. Your typical questions had swarmed into my mind after the whole ordeal. Was the car in the parking lot earlier connected to the person? Why was that person alone on the playground at that time? Most bizarre of all, why did he wear a mask? Most chilling of all, had that person been watching us the whole time we were there? These questions remain unanswered, and I still obsess over them to this day occasionally. Living in a small town like ours, this certainly wasn't ordinary. Our town in general is safe, and nothing majorly bad has happened in the years I've lived here. Maybe it was some sort of weird prank, but that couldn't explain it considering the fact that these people had no idea we were coming. If anyone has suggestions, I'd love your input. This has honestly stumped me. It would probably ease the intense curiosity I found myself in after remembering this incident once again. Even though this was seriously messed up, it hasn't been the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, but it certainly was eerie and unexplainable. Nowadays, I make an effort to steer clear of any obvious possible trouble. Being young at the time, I was daring, and I guess that's what led to my naive personality.
Strange Animal Attack from Midnight Caven. I used to work as a police officer. The county I worked for was a rural one. Lots of old worn-down homes surrounded by trees and dirt roads. That kind of thing. We got a lot of calls about break-ins and domestic disputes, even the occasional drive-by. The county had a bit of a drug problem. It got pretty rough, so much so that my mom tried to convince me every time I saw her to quit that job, as, how did she say it? Me working as a cop was going to be the death of me and her. This is about my craziest experience working as a cop, and honestly, it did change how I believe things. It was about 7 p.m., after dark for sure. I was in the rundown parking lot of an old grocery store. We were in the cruiser, my partner and I, when we got a call from dispatch that we needed to head over to this trailer, way out in the boonies, basically deep in the countryside. We take the call and drive about 15 minutes into the woods. We finally arrive at the place. The double-wide trailer was in pretty good condition. It looked like whoever lived there had built their own deck on the front. The land was well kept, and there was a nice little garden out back, with a single light coming from a telephone pole toward the front by the street. Actually, it was more of a dirt road. If I didn't already have a wife and a mortgage to pay for, this place seemed like a pretty nice place to live. Then again, it was a bit too far out of the way for my tastes. I mean, it took us 15 minutes to get here. Who wants to wait 15 minutes after calling the cops? Despite our headlights shining in through the windows on the trailer, no one even attempts to come outside to greet us. And since the call was about some sort of home invasion or possibly even an animal attack, when we got out of the car, I had my holster unstrapped, and I was ready to grab the gun. My partner and I steadily approached the door. We knocked, and after a few moments, a middle-aged man without a shirt greets us, with a little girl, probably his daughter, maybe even granddaughter, holding close to his hip, sucking on one of her fingers. She seemed pretty frightened. Before introductions, he hurriedly invited us inside, and as we entered, he kept looking left and right outside before closing the door. I noticed that his wife was leaning against the kitchen counter to our right. She seemed to be wiping tears from her face with what appeared to be a moist rag. The man invited us over to the couch while he sat in a recliner, and the little girl sat next to him in the floor. He leaned forward, and he began to tell us what was going on. I take some notes on a notepad. The man says they were watching TV just after having supper, when something huge hits the side of the trailer really hard, causing the structure to start swaying back and forth for a moment. The three of them got real quiet. Then whatever it was out there hits the opposite side of the trailer. This is when the man goes to get his rifle from the wall, which he then let us know was placed in the hanging gun case still on the wall.
because he didn't want to have it out when the cops arrived. Anyway, the man cautiously goes outside to investigate, and he swears he sees the tallest man he'd ever seen, big and burly. Describes them about 3 times as wide as any man. The guy was leaning against the trailer, like he was trying to listen from outside. The man did not see the owner of the trailer outside with his rifle, and as the owner still wasn't sure if it was a man or something else, he fired off a warning shot into a mound of dirt toward the side of his property. This person turns immediately, facing the owner. The guy then admits that in that moment he realized he wasn't facing a person. This big and burly creature runs towards him, admitting that firing off his only loaded round at the moment into a pile of dirt was a mistake. As he desperately tries to back up and chamber another round, this big beast runs into him, practically throwing him into the dirt, before the thing kept running and disappeared into the woods. "Knocked the wind right out of me," the guy said. I wasn't really believing his story. I ask him if he's been on any substances as of late, which he quickly fires back with a no, and that's a rude question to ask in front of his daughter. I apologize, and then I let them know that the most we could do at the moment was walk around the property right quick, and we could stay in the patrol car for a couple of hours just to keep an eye out. The delighted man says thank you, and that his family would feel much safer that night if we did. My partner and I exit the home. With our flashlights out, we circle the perimeter of the property real quick, meeting in the middle on the other side, before heading back to the patrol car. I didn't see any weird footprints or traces of someone trying to break in the home or attacking the home. No tufts of hair or claw marks or anything like that to indicate an animal attack either. So we sit back down in our patrol car, and we're ready to stay there for another couple of hours, unless of course we get called away again. During this time, my partner and I are discussing what we thought about the whole thing. I say I don't believe a word of it. The guy was probably drinking, if not on something else. At the very most, it could have been a bear that came up on their trailer, probably smelled their dinner and was desperate to get some for himself. My partner, on the other hand, said that he was giving them the benefit of the doubt. He'd heard some crazy stuff could go down in the woods, especially this far out. After all, it could have been a big dude, some maniac trying to get inside, take their stuff, or even try to murder them. I sigh, replying that I hope that's not the case. A wild bear would be far more simple to deal with than some murderer being on the loose. We sat quiet for a while, with me growing more and more tired from the long day by the minute. About 45 minutes of waiting in, my partner shakes me to get my attention. I apparently did end up dozing off for a second. But my partner is now not speaking clearly. He's just pointing out the window and stuttering. I squint my eyes, and then I see what he's pointing at. There's an absolutely massive figure walking between the trees in the woods. Whoever it is sort of looking at the trailer home. Their eyes occasionally flicker with yellow, reflecting light from the moon. This guy must have been 8 feet tall, not even joking. I shake my head and try to wake up a bit, and realize that what I'm looking at can't just be some guy. People don't get that big, and this thing is huge. He's big around as a couple of oak trees fused together, darker than that too. The two of us, in a panic, debate on whether or not to get out at all. I didn't think we were dealing with a person anymore. I got on the radio with dispatch, letting them know that they should probably send out some animal control. I simply say that we got a pretty big bear out here. I know that was a lie, but I wasn't about to make myself sound crazy. I watched the creature stalk the woods back and forth. I'm sitting there praying in my head that it doesn't come out of those trees. Eventually, it disappears back into the woods,
and I think I literally sigh with relief. A few moments later, a massive head-sized rock hits my partner's window. We both curse and he nearly climbs on top of me. Animal control eventually arrives, and I finally feel safe enough to leave the car. I tell the guys what we saw, and don't know if it's still out there either. They joke about it being Bigfoot, but we didn't deny that. At first, they laughed until they saw our reaction to it. We went back to the family inside and let them know that there may be a large bear around the property. Animal control took over from there, and we reported back to the station. After this experience, honestly, I do believe that Bigfoot exists. In my mind, there is no mistake that we saw something that night that didn't match up with our current reality, something that wasn't human. I'm much more easy to believe people rather than accusing them of being on drugs.
My Strange Police Chase, from Eddie Versace. Police are people we're supposed to trust, but sometimes they don't mean well. Let me tell you of my creepy police encounter. My friend, my girlfriend, and myself were driving home from college. We decided to stop at a McDonald's and eat quickly, so we stopped, ordered our food, and ate. As we were eating, my girlfriend noticed 2 policemen walking in, but they both looked dirty, like they hadn't showered in ages. They didn't order anything, and simply sat at the table in front of us. She told me this, and I simply said, they're probably just here to make sure there's no trouble. So we continued eating. I got up to ask for some extra sauce, and when I get back, they were staring at us. I felt a chill run down my spine. When we were about to open the door to leave, I turned back and they're still staring. I quickly turn away and go inside our car. I tell my girlfriend and our friend about it, and they looked worried. My girlfriend said that while I went to get sauce, they were staring at them while they were at the table. My veins run cold, and we turn on the car to leave. As soon as I do, I see the policemen leaving McDonald's and getting inside their cruiser. I get out of the parking lot and leave. Since we still needed 2 hours to get home, we went to the gas station to fill up. As I exit the car to pump the tank, I see a police car pull up, and of course it's the same policeman from McDonald's. My girlfriend and our friend notice this as well, and we both get out in case something happened. This makes me feel a bit better. But nothing happened. They stayed in their car and stared at us. As we begin to drive away, the same policemen are driving behind us. At this point, I'm beyond terrified. I just want to get home and be safe. My friends tell me to speed up, take some weird turns here and there and try to lose them. I do just that, but the police continued to follow, always staring. We drove, using a quarter of the tank I just bought, until finally we decided to just go home. With the cops following us, I drop off my friend at his place. Then I go to my girlfriend's house, where we stay for the night. But as we're getting out of the car, the police cruiser drives up and watches us walk inside. I can see their faces. They're so stern, so serious and angry. Thinking about those policemen still gives me the chills to this day. I have no idea what they wanted, and I'm so glad that nothing happened that night, and that we all made it home safely. If I ever have an emergency, I hope it's not those policemen that come to my quote-unquote rescue. Scary police experience from Jack. Location: Minot, North Dakota. My dad was working for the Minot police for 24 years, until he retired shortly after this event. My dad and his coworker were called to a red house on the corner of a 4th Avenue. Earlier, a young woman in her late 20s called, reporting a woman screaming for her life. The thing is, my dad says, that house had been vacant for 25 years, and it had been marked as abandoned. My dad and his coworker, Jay, walked up to the house and proceeded to open the door when he heard the loudest, blood-curdling scream. It was coming from upstairs, so my dad and Jay almost crapped themselves after hearing it. They pulled their sidearms and proceeded to open the door. My dad described the house to have one staircase leading to the upstairs and one basement. So my dad told Jay to go upstairs and he would search the main level. But Jay said he wasn't going upstairs without him. Note, both of these men were 6 feet and weighed close to 200 pounds. My dad agreed to go with Jay. They started to walk up the narrow staircase, and they could soon hear scratching noises coming from upstairs. When they made it to the last step, the scream came again. This time it sounded like a goat getting attacked. Now there were 2 rooms upstairs. One was open and one was shut. My dad grew a pair, so he proceeded to open the door, the shut one, I mean. When he flung the door open, there was no one inside, but he noticed that there was this red stuff pouring out from the closet. Jay and my dad were about to open the door when they heard laughter coming from the other room. They turned their backs to the closet when the scream came inches away from them. They immediately ran downstairs as fast as possible. But my dad admits, before they began running, he saw a man in his 50s chewing on what appeared to be a human arm, one that was attached to a woman screaming next to him. My dad and Jay called for the SWAT team to come in and get this man. When the man was pulled out of the house, he had only one eye and he had human flesh hanging from his mouth. Later, my dad was told that there was a man in the closet with a knife waiting for someone to open the door. If they hadn't run from that situation, they may not have made it out alive at all.
Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.